of the consumer goods in its structure, etc., will be neglected. Billy says you told me years ago that Reagan will be the actual author of the hitherto largest world arms race. Semyaza says sure, he will be the man who will initiate the basic things that can then possibly lead to a third world war in the distant future. Billy says that will, however, not be carried out under the scepter of Reagan, or will it? Semyaza says no, and this represents good fortune for Earth humanity. If he were to be the decisive word in such a war, then the entire Earth would be destroyed. Billy says which would probably correspond to an atomization. Semyaza says yes. Billy says then hopefully, there will also be people who will recognize these things early. Semyaza says that will be the case, and his very inglorious end is already certain, as also that of the murderous Ayatollah Khomeini, whose end begins to be at hand in the first days of February 1981, when he is struck with an illness that he cannot be healed from, which will also happen to Reagan in a later time when he is struck by Alzheimer's disease and will have a tragic end. Billy says it will only bring about one less murderer in this world. But as a rule, nothing better follows such. Semyaza says unfortunately, that is the truth, and it will still remain as such for a very long time. Billy says the world would, indeed, otherwise come to peace. Semyaza says yes. And the imperious powers wouldn't like that. Billy says and these power twerps wouldn't like that. Semyaza says sure, but now listen more. Ayatollah Khomeini and his allies will, in the first months of 1981, play around with the idea that the Ayatollah should allow himself to be treated by notable physicians in Switzerland. The realization of this attempt, however, is still presently questionable because no clear picture can be determined yet. The Khomeini's brain functions are damaged, which is why with him, arbitrary actions and resolutions often go into action, which cannot be predicted in their final form very often. For this reason, this occurrence in Switzerland cannot be predicted with any certainty, and neither can the trip of the Pope to Switzerland, who is concerned with the thought of visiting your mother country in the middle of the year 1981. Certain factors of uncertainty are also present with the Pope which could, at the least, postpone his trip. On the whole, the entire year of 1981 holds a great deal of uncertain factors, which is why very precise numerical data can only be made on rare occasions, just as in other cases, which do not allow themselves to have absolute certainty as to whether a particular event will arrive now or not. This, however, exclusively applies to events which have direct reference to people. This is so only because in particular, the year 1981, in reference to the actions of people, will be controlled by such persons whose material consciousness and brains exhibit damages, which will lead to arbitrary, hot-tempered, and unpredictable actions. This will also be the case with Prince Charles of England, who will become engaged to a certain Diana Frances Spencer, which will then lead to a marriage in the first half of the year if these plans are not wavered again by the instability of this man. On the other hand, it would be very beneficial if Prince Charles would not marry this girl, because when this marriage is actually realized, it will not run a happy course, especially not for Diane, who under the prevailing craze, adultery, intemperance, capriciousness, and other emotional outbursts of the prince, will have to suffer with difficulty, which will try to be concealed for a long time by the royal house by all means until everything becomes official and a divorce takes place on August 28, 1996, according to which 1 year later, Diana will suffer a fatal accident in Paris. Also uncertain in Spain is the matter, which is very insecure in its outcome, where attempts will be made to overthrow the government. Approximately in the month of February, 1981, so our calculations show, the military will, in turn, try to seize the power for itself in that country. According to our calculations, however, this coup attempt will have to fail because the best friend of King Juan Carlos cannot obtain his assistance. But here, Human beings also play a very important role, whose material consciousnesses are not fully functional and who have some damages to their brains. For this reason, an accurate prediction in this case also cannot be ensured. However, those events that are to be released naturally are to be determined very precisely, even when they often arise in certain parts, at the fault of the Earth people. It is certain that shortly after February 20, 1981, the southern part of Greece will be shaken by a moderately severe earthquake. The human losses, however, will not be high and will be limited to a maximum of about 250. This earthquake, however, will truly only represent a continuation of those earthquakes that have their origin in Agadir and that will move on to Italy, where the real big quakes will truly begin, and by what means the chain of earthquakes will no longer break off for a long time. As explained, Greece will be the next country after Italy to be shaken, whereby in that place, as in Italy, an end to the quakes will not be found for a long time. From Greece, the quakes will then move on to Japan, and in addition, Yugoslavia, South America, Russia, all the Balkan states, and also Europe will not be spared in the end. Thus, Italy will be the actual starting point of that large chain of weak to most severe earthquakes, which will shake the earth from the end of 1980 and in the beginning of 1981 throughout many years until far into the third millennium and bring death and destruction over the people, whereby the Earth human being has contributed a lot to this and will further serve to encourage these quakes. The beginning of this time of severe earthquakes is also connected with a large climatic overthrow, whereby this will already become apparent at the end of the year 1980 through a very harsh winter that will bring an unusually large amount of snow and will reach down into the areas of the desert of Sinai and the Sahara, where by far areas of Africa will also have to suffer under this winter. After that, over many decades, wild waters will appear all over the world, causing large areas of many countries to suffer from floods that bring death, destruction, and annihilation. Another fact that won't bring any more joy to the Earth human being is that the earthly astronomers will unexpectedly admit that they were mistaken about the total size and expansion of the universe and that they have discovered new galaxies in the universe of gigantic size and at great distances, of which they will suppose, until then, that the end of the universe would be there. Billy says, aha, so some will have to admit their mistakes once again, but that's nothing more than what is right. But can you explain to me why you said that the tragic end of the American president is already certain through the incurable Alzheimer's disease? Semyaza says, I will tell you details about that later. For now, I would like to address your question only so far that I tell you that this man's life is very endangered and that already shortly after his assumption of office, enigmatic enemies will be deployed who will want to assassinate him. It is still too early to talk about this now because this does not fit into our chronological order of the list of coming events at this time. At present, I stand with my explanations only in the initial months of the year 1981. However, up to the middle of the year 1981, there are still many things to explain, which will happen on Earth within a great part of the framework and which will come into play. Billy says, of course, I didn't want to anticipate you. It just occurred to me in such a way. That's why I asked you about it. Semyaza says, I understand. Nevertheless, I would still like to retain a chronological order of the detailing of upcoming events. Billy says, I also have nothing to object to that. Semyaza says, there might not be sufficient time today to tell you about all of the important events of the nearer and more distant future. I would then have to continue this at other times. Billy says, I also don't have any objections against that. If your time is no longer sufficient, then you can simply tell me later about the remainder of these things. Semyaza says, sure, the time is, perhaps, not quite sufficient for me today because I have already used much time with what I have explained to you so far. Billy says, then just some other time. Semyaza says, no, there is something I can still tell you. There is still some time that remains for me. Billy says, I don't want to bring you into trouble. Semyaza says, no, certainly not, I just have to take up my work